They thought they could hand me a fake legal document, kick me out of the family, and steal a $95 million estate before the funeral flowers even wilted. They thought I was just a quiet, helpless wife who didn't understand how money worked. But they made one fatal mistake. They forgot to ask what kind of law I practice. Today, they are about to learn that you never try to play legal games with the person who holds the keys to the vault. My name is Amaya Griffith. I am 32 years old, a senior partner at one of the most prestigious litigation firms in Manhattan, and for 4 years I was the silently tolerated wife of Julian Vance. The rain beating against the frosted glass windows of the Grand Vance family study did little to soften the icy cold atmosphere inside. The funeral service for my father-in-law, Richard Vance, had ended barely 2 hours ago, but the grief in the house had already vanished, replaced by an unmistakable, sharp stench of greed. I sat quietly on the edge of a velvet armchair, my hands resting calmly in my lap. Across the polished darkwood coffee table sat my mother-in-law, Victoria Vance, and my husband, Julian. Victoria was a woman who treated every family gathering like an audition for royalty, holding her porcelain teacup as if she were above the very room she sat in. Beside her, Julian stood with his arms crossed, adjusting his gold wristwatch with nervous, hurried motions. For 4 years, they had viewed me as nothing more than an outsider, an easy target to ignore, talk down to, and push into the background. They knew I worked at a law firm, but whenever I tried to talk about my career, Julian would change the subject, brushing it off as uninteresting office paperwork. They had never bothered to ask what I actually did. Victoria set her teacup down with a sharp click against the saucer. She reached into her leather handbag, pulled out a stapled set of papers, and slid them across the table toward me. "Sign it and leave," Victoria said, her voice dry, sharp, and completely devoid of warmth. "You have no business being here now that Richard is gone." I looked down at the document. The top heading read, "Voluntary Waiver of Estate Interest and Claim Deed." "What is this, Victoria?" I asked softly, keeping my voice completely level. Julian took a step forward, leaning over the back of his mother's chair. He didn't look me in the eyes. Instead, he looked at the paper with an air of cold impatience. "It's standard paperwork, Amaya," Julian said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Dad's financial affairs are complicated. The family holdings, the real estate, the bank accounts, it's all tied up in long-standing family trusts. You were only married to me for 4 years. You didn't contribute to Dad's wealth, so you don't belong in the inheritance discussions. You don't need to understand any of this. Just sign the waiver so my mother and I can settle the estate with the lawyers tomorrow." I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I slowly leaned forward, picked up the stapled packet, and opened to the very first page. My eyes, trained by years of reading high-stakes estate litigation contracts, scanned the page in seconds. I saw the clumsy legal phrasing immediately. I noticed the missing notary seal, the vague language regarding asset distribution, and the outright illegal attempt to force a surviving family member to surrender statutory rights. I read one paragraph out loud, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "The undersigned hereby irrevocably forfeits all rights, claims, present or future disclosures, and legal standing regarding the estate, personal property, and liquid assets of Richard Vance, waiving all rights to probate court notification." I looked up from the page, my dark eyes fixing directly on Victoria's cold face. "This isn't a real court document, Victoria," I said, a faint, dangerous smile playing at the corners of my lips. "This is an amateurish attempt at a forced surrender agreement. You pulled this off a cheap internet legal template, printed it in the study, and filled in the blanks hoping I would be intimidated enough to sign it." Victoria's posture stiffened. Her eyes flashed with sudden, ugly fury. "Don't you dare talk back to me in my own house. You are an outsider in this family. You came into this marriage with nothing, and you will leave with nothing. Richard's money belongs to Julian and me. You sign that paper right now, or I will have you removed from this property." Julian stepped up beside his mother, tapping his finger hard against the table. "Amaya, stop playing games. You don't know how probate works. You don't know anything about estate administration. Just sign the paper and stop making a scene. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I simply leaned back into my chair, crossed my legs, and looked at my husband with deep, quiet pity. I don't know how probate works, Julian, I asked softly. No, you don't, Julian snapped back. This is high-level asset division. It's complicated, high-stakes legal work. It's way out of your depth. I gently placed the document back down on the coffee table. I reached over to my black leather briefcase sitting beside my chair, unlocked the dual brass latches with 2 crisp clicks, and opened the lid. I pulled out a thick navy blue leather-bound binder with heavy gold lettering stamped across the front cover. I placed it down directly next to Victoria's cheap, stapled waiver. Victoria squinted at the gold lettering on the binder. Julian frowned, taking a step closer. Did Dad tell you? I began, my voice ringing out through the quiet room like a chime. That he called me 6 months ago? Julian stopped dead in his tracks. What? 6 months ago, I continued smoothly. Your father called my direct line at the firm. He didn't call the family attorney, and he certainly didn't call you, Julian. He drove to my office in Manhattan on a Tuesday afternoon, sat across from my desk for 3 hours, and asked me to handle something very confidential. Victoria's face paled slightly, though she tried to maintain her scowl. What are you talking about? Richard would never go to you for business. Richard knew exactly who I was, Victoria, I said, opening the heavy binder to the very first page. Unlike you and Julian, Richard actually asked me about my career. He knew that I am a senior partner specializing in probate and trust litigation. The room fell into a terrifying silence. Julian's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He came to my office because he was terrified, I said, my eyes locking onto Julian. He discovered 6 months ago that you and your mother were quietly forging his signature on secondary property deeds. He discovered that you were moving funds out of his personal accounts into offshore shells while he was in the hospital. That's a lie, Victoria shrieked, her voice cracking with panic. That is a complete filthy lie. Is it? I replied calmly. 'Cause 6 months ago, Richard executed a brand new, legally binding, irrevocable living trust. He canceled every prior will, revoked your power of attorney, and restructured his entire $95 million estate. I looked up at Julian, whose face had gone completely white, drained of every drop of color. And he appointed me as the sole, independent trustee and executor of his entire estate. Victoria gasped, grabbing the table for support. Julian took a horrified step backward, staring at the thick navy binder in absolute terror. I rested my hands flat on top of the legal binder, looking at the two of them with absolute authority. So no, Victoria, I said, pushing the cheap waiver paper back toward them. I won't be signing your paper. But you are going to want to sit down, because we are about to read your husband's true final wishes. Victoria collapsed heavily into her velvet armchair, her hands shaking so violently that her gold bracelets clinked against each other. Julian stood frozen next to her, staring at the thick navy binder on the coffee table as if it were an explosive device waiting to detonate. The arrogance that had filled the room just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a suffocating, heavy dread. This is impossible, Julian stammered, his voice cracking with desperation. My father was sick. He wasn't in his right mind 6 months ago. Whatever paper you have in that binder, I'll contest it in court. I'll have it thrown out for undue influence. I turned a page in the binder, my voice remaining entirely calm and measured. I anticipated you would say that, Julian. Which is why your father underwent a full psychiatric evaluation by 3 independent board-certified physicians on the exact afternoon he signed this trust. All 3 medical reports are notarized and attached to page 4. He was found to be of sound mind, fully competent, and under 0 duress. I adjusted my glasses, looking down at the crisp white pages of the trust agreement. Now, let us read Section 4, Paragraph B, I continued, my voice echoing through the grand, quiet study. In the event that my son, Julian Vance, or my wife, Victoria Vance, present any forged documents, altered deeds, or fraudulent waivers to my appointed trustee or the probate court, all conditional distributions designated for them shall immediately freeze pending a forensic audit. Victoria's eyes widened in sheer terror. A forensic audit? Yes, Victoria, I said, looking directly at her. Your late husband authorized me to hire a forensic accounting team to review every single transfer made out of his primary operating accounts over the last 3 years. Do you know what we found during our preliminary audit last week? Neither of them answered. Julian looked down at the carpet, sweat glistening along his hairline. We discovered that over $2.4 million was quietly funneled into a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, I stated, my tone sharp and precise. A shell corporation registered under your personal name, Victoria. And we found that Julian signed his father's name to 2 property quitclaim deeds while Richard was sedated in the intensive care unit. Amaya, please, Julian blurted out, dropping to his knees beside my chair. He reached out, trying to grab my hand, but I pulled it away smoothly before he could touch me. Amaya, look at me. I'm your husband. We're married. Whatever happened between my mother and my father, you and I are a team. You can just overlook the audit. You're the sole trustee. You have the power to settle this quietly. I looked down at Julian kneeling on the floor, the man who had stood by for 4 years while his mother treated me like hired help, the man who had just handed me a fraudulent document telling me I had no business in his family. Section 7, Clause C, I read out loud, ignoring his desperate pleading. If any beneficiary attempts to alter the estate, commit financial fraud against the grantor, or coerce the appointed trustee, said beneficiary shall be subject to the immediate execution of the in terrorem clause. Julian's face went entirely ghost-white. As a man raised around wealth, he knew exactly what that legal phrase meant. The no contest clause, Julian whispered, horror breaking his voice. Correct, I said smoothly. By handing me that illegal waiver today, and by attempting to bypass probate court through fraudulent means, you and your mother have officially triggered the automatic forfeiture clause of Richard Vance's trust. No. You can't do this, Victoria screamed, jumping to her feet and slamming her hands on the table. You can't strip us of our inheritance. Richard was my husband. Julian is his son. That money belongs to us. It belonged to Richard, I corrected cold-faced. And Richard chose how his life's work would be distributed. Under the terms of the Act of Trust, because of your documented financial misconduct, your share of the $95 million estate has been officially reduced to the absolute minimum allowed by law. I turned to the final signature page and held it up so they could both see the bold, black ink of Richard Vance's signature. You and Julian have been left exactly $1 each, I stated clearly. The remainder of the liquid assets, the family real estate, and all investment portfolios are being transferred directly into the Richard Vance Charitable Foundation, dedicated to funding medical research for the very condition that took his life. Victoria gasped, clutching her chest as if she couldn't catch her breath. She sank back into her chair, sobbing hysterically into her handkerchief. Julian looked at me, tears streaming down his face, completely undone. Amaya, please, you can't leave me with nothing. I have debts. The offshore accounts are frozen by the audit. How am I supposed to live? How am I supposed to pay for anything? I closed the thick navy binder with a solid, echoing thud. I latched my leather briefcase, stood up, and smoothed down my tailored black blazer. You are 34 years old, Julian, I said, looking down at my soon-to-be ex-husband with complete indifference. You have a college degree that your father paid for. You can get a job. As you so eloquently told me 20 minutes ago, estate matters are far too complicated for you to understand anyway. I picked up my briefcase and stepped around his kneeling frame on the floor. I walked toward the heavy double doors of the study, stopping just before I reached the handle. You have 24 hours to vacate this property before the trust security team changes the locks, I added softly without turning around. My divorce attorney will be serving you with dissolution papers tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. I pulled open the grand wooden door and walked out into the cool, rainy evening, leaving the sobbing remnants of the Vance family behind in the quiet room. They had spent 4 years assuming I was powerless because I didn't boast about my work. They had tried to push me into a corner, confident that my silence meant compliance. But in the end, justice wasn't delivered with shouting or dramatic scenes. It was delivered with 20 pages of ironclad law and a single signature. And as I stepped into my car, driving away from the Vance estate for the very last time, I knew I was walking into a future entirely on my own terms.